this is Tyler with TJack Survival, Survival Dispatch. I have been asked to talk about ham radios. The problem with ham radios is everyone goes super deep dive to the bottom of the rabbit hole, confuses people and loses them. So this is going to be a basics video, what they are, what they're capable of, just a simple question and answers that I get every time I help a new person become a ham radio operator. So stick with me. Okay, we're going to break at the whiteboard. Sorry, but this is happening. Let's start with something everyone knows. Okay, everyone knows about AM/FM radio, all right? Amplitude modulation modulates the strength of the amps going into the system. Frequency modulation modulates left and right of the frequency. The reason we use amplitude modulation is because when we're in low frequencies, there's not a lot of space left and right. The reason we use frequency modulation is when we have a band that has a lot of higher frequencies, there's more space left and right. Hopefully this will make sense. When you have a waveform, looks kind of like this, right? And when we amplitude modulate, we push more power up and down with the sound of the voice. So it's like, and the amplitude changes with the voice. Let's say this frequency is 30 or in the 20s. 20 megahertz, 30 megahertz is in the CB range or a military band space. So if we want to make it a higher frequency, we push it up. If we want it to be a lower frequency, we push it down, maybe down really low. So that's the basics of amplitude modulation. Frequency modulation. I need an eraser. Beaver mitt for the win. Frequency modulation. What we're doing is we're putting the lower part of the voice on one side of the frequency and the higher part of the voice on the other. Okay? And we're modulating that back and forth from the bottom to the top of the frequency. Now this is a small spike. This is a narrow band spike. If we're listening to wide band or what you normally listen to on your AM/FM radio station, it looks more like this. It looks more like a mountain, right? So if I can only go 3 megahertz below my radio station of 105.7, it's supposed to be a point. If I can only go 3 megahertz below 105.7, then I only have so much bandwidth. I don't have the capacity to go to really low noises. If I can only go to 3 megahertz above, I don't have the capacity to do really high noises. So wide bandwidth or a wide usage of sound gives me really low noises and really high noises, okay? So when you look at a spectrum analyzer at the AM/FM radio stations, or at least the FM radio stations that you listen to local, it looks more like a stack or a hill and less like a spike. And that's what bandwidth is on an FM radio station. Now, let's talk about bands or frequencies. A band is a space on the electromagnetic spectrum that works with one antenna, right? That's really dumbing it down. But if I have 1 megahertz, 1 megahertz, MHz. Now, if we're talking about the system here, we have mega, giga, deca, right? And it's all the same number, we just moved the decimal point 3 spaces. So on the bottom of the HF range, or the high frequency, we have 1 megahertz. At the top of the HF range, we got 30 megahertz. Then we get into very high frequency, VHF. And then ultra high frequency, UHF, until eventually we're in the Wi-Fi range, which is 2,400 to 5,000 megahertz or 2.4 to 5 gigahertz. Right? I'm gonna put Wi-Fi. Now, the reason we spaced all this up is because these frequencies have different properties. Attenuation being the act of something absorbing the electromagnetic spectrum or absorbing the light affects these things differently. On the lower frequencies, things don't attenuate, they don't absorb into mountains as well, right? And in fact, in this lower HF range, these frequencies will bounce off of the ionosphere of the planet like a mirror. What that means is if there's a lot of ionic activity in the upper atmosphere, these frequencies, when they hit it, will bounce it, go up and down and up and down. You'll have skip zones and it'll bounce all the way around the planet. That's why shortwave or HF radios talk long distances, because they reflect off of the ionosphere. VHF will have a tendency to punch through the ionosphere. It's kind of cool. You can do stuff like send a signal to the moon and bounce it off the moon and send it around. VHF is going to be more, let me give you an exact number here. So HF is 1 megahertz to 30 megahertz. VHF, or very high frequency, is 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz. Ultra high frequency is 300 megahertz to 3000 megahertz, which is 3 gigahertz. And that gets up into the Wi-Fi range on the top of that. Okay, so I'll put 3000 or 3.0 gigahertz, right? The reason this stuff is important is because we will use the frequency to calculate how big the antenna is, and that tells us what antenna size we need to talk. You can listen to just about anything with any antenna size. You can't talk out or resonate properly without the antenna that fits the size of the wavelength that you're doing. There's some huge size differences from 1 megahertz to 300, and it's basically 162 feet or 165 feet to 10 feet or 10 meters. Okay, there's a massive amount of difference. So the 40 meter band, or the 40 meter size, is all contained within 7 gigahertz. I'm sorry, megahertz. The 40 meter band is all contained within 7 megahertz. There's other bands that are there's a 40 meter, a 20 meter, and 10 meter band, and all that means is you need a 10 meter, 20 meter, 40 meter antenna in order to resonate properly. And that's not completely factually correct, because you can cut the antenna in half and cut it in half again and still resonate, and that changes the way or the length of the bubble of radiation that it's creating, and it changes the way that we talk to people. That's getting kind of deep. Think of it like changing your flashlight. You turn the flashlight, it focuses the beam. You turn it out, it changes the beam wide. Changing your antenna shape will change that beam in the same way. So without worrying about it too much, what you need to know is 1 megahertz is a really big freaking antenna. All the way down to 30 megahertz, that's the size of those antennas you see slapping around on Humvees. When we start getting in the VHF, to the very high frequency, you're going to get into police bands, ham radio bands, and a lot of the handy-talkie. You call them walkie-talkies in ham radio, they are handy-talkies, right? We'll get into that band. I'm just going to put a spectrum here. There's our spectrum: 1 megahertz, 30 megahertz, 300 megahertz, 3000 megahertz Wi-Fi. Before I get off this topic, we use these HF or shortwave radio frequencies to talk big distances because they reflect off the ionosphere. We use these frequencies to talk line of sight because they won't reflect off the ionosphere, which is good. I'm talking to people I can see in the valley instead of bouncing my stuff around the mountain. I don't want people to hear me outside of there. I want them to hear local. The way that we will restrict the distance of our antenna or our radio is either shorten the antenna too much so that it physically retards the lob that it creates and makes it smaller, or reduce the power setting so that it just can't get out and it attenuates into water, air, mountains, trees, those type of things. And it just can't reach very far. That's good to know, because if you go to Walmart, buy one of those family radio services radios, the FRS radios, they have a stunted antenna which retards the lob and shortens it. And they also have a very low wattage, 1.5 in the first 2 frequencies, up to 3, if I remember correctly, in the next 13 frequencies. It's not going to talk very far. The antenna's not big enough and it doesn't have enough power. If I get a normal 2 meter antenna with a 1/4 wavelength, normal 2 meter radio with a 1/4 wavelength antenna, it's going to talk further because this can go all the way up to 5 watts with an appropriate size antenna. It can easily go 60 miles, or the curvature of the earth. Now, in all fairness, those little family radio services work in the UHF frequency, not the VHF frequency. So when you're working with ham radios, the very beginner tech stuff, you're going to be in VHF, very high frequency. The tech range, don't quote me here, it's like 140 to 158 or something megahertz. So I'll have to look that one up, but let's get exact with this. If you want a list of the bands that ham radio operators are allowed to operate, you go to the ARRL band plan. Okay, just slap in Google ARRL band plan and it will give you the chart. The certifications at the bottom are technician, that's the entry level one, general, and then extra. The technician just gives you those UHF, VHF frequencies and a little bit of HF that you can play with to kind of, get your feet wet and figure out how it works. The general gives you about 90% of everything, of all the HF and all of the UHF, VHF, some of the packet stuff and the more complicated things. The extra gives you that last little bit of the band that you didn't have before, but you can only talk to other extras. So in my opinion, the best one is the general. That's my current ranking. A technician, you can study for 4 hours on a Saturday, take the test next week and pass it. A general, maybe study pretty solid for a week, take the test and pass it. An extra, maybe study pretty solid for a month. The differences are, in a technician, you're learning what the names are, the frequencies, the very basics. In a general, you're learning about HF, wave propagation, antenna building. In an extra, you're building radios from scratch. It gets very complicated and that becomes a lot harder. The place to get this studied up on is the website www.hamstudy.org. There's a ton out there, I don't care what you use, this is the one I used, www.hamstudy.org. The reason I like it is the flashcards that you do on this website look exactly like the tests that you take when it comes time to take the test. So you pay $14 at a testing station local to you, you're gonna have to Google that one, and you answer the exact same questions from the exact same question pool with the exact same answers that you just studied on flashcards on hamstudy.org. And that's the way that you get your technician. If you want to study more, you can, and you pass your technician, you can take your general test right there while you're there at the same time for the same $14. UHF, this is going to be your 2 meter range. And I'm going to explain the math on that in just a second. This is what the majority of you are using right now or have. If you've got a family radio services radio, a ham radio, a Baofeng, one of these dudes right here, okay? Motorola, police radio, they all use 2 meter, right? And the reason that they do that is because a 6 foot tall person can reach around a perfect sphere 60 miles, because the curvature of the earth stops them at that altitude. So understanding that, in order to communicate properly, have the right antenna for the right frequency. The taller you can get, the more you can see around the trees, the buildings, the mountains, and the earth. So it is possible to talk 600 miles on 2 meter, but you gotta be really tall and you gotta have a really focused beam, which we do with a Yagi antenna. You don't need to know the details on it, you just need to know that it can do it. But there's those rules. Have the right antenna for the frequency you're on, be the tallest thing in the area, and when those two fail, put out all the power you can put out, right? Catch that thing on fire. So if you want to communicate long distances, the right antenna, the taller the better, more power until you got to stop. There are power limits within ham radios that you have to stop at, or you will actually burn things, catch them on fire, and get cited by the FCC. Okay, so moving up into ultra high frequency. These attenuate substantially. They are absorbed into stuff. These are great for local areas when you don't need to talk big distances. These also have more frequencies available in that space, so you can have a wider bandwidth and put better quality sound through this than you can this, right? That's why FM sounds better than AM, amplitude modulation versus frequency modulation. This is what we will use for when you get an area that's saturated with a bunch of repeaters in the 2 meter range. They'll start using the ultra high frequency range as a backup. They will run packet data, they will run video, whatever the more advanced stuff is ends up being this range. And if you want a radio that doesn't talk a long distance like Wi-Fi, you go clear up to 2.4 to 5 gigahertz, which is 2,400 megahertz to 5,000 megahertz. Same thing, right? We just moved the decimal 3 spots. And the reason that we do that with Wi-Fi is I don't actually want to send my Wi-Fi signal up to the next state over. I could do it if I was using this range or this range, but then I would stomp on everything and I would be the only person that can do it. That's basically how a jammer works, right? So the reason that we push Wi-Fi devices, or the reason that they have allocated Wi-Fi devices to this range, is to make them so they can only talk inside of your house without bumping the Wi-Fi that's in your neighbor's house, right? It's not that we can't do it, it's that we purposely retard the lob or the bubble so that it shrinks and reflects inside of our house. We turn the lights down so we don't blind the neighbors, right? Okay. So I feel like you need to talk about what RF or radio frequencies or radio is, right? It's two things. It's electrical and it's magnetic. Two different polarities, right? RF radiation is the same thing as light, is the same thing as ultraviolet radiation, is the same thing as X-ray. It's just a different size, a different frequency. That's it. Your eyeballs are a little antenna like a radio, and they're absorbing a visual light spectrum. If our eyeballs were bigger, we should be able to see bigger spectrums of light, right? If I had 160 something wide eyeball, I should be able to see what HF 1 megahertz looks like, but I don't. So understanding that, when we know that we can conceptually look at it like light, it's easier to understand how antennas work, right? That antenna is a filament that throws light out in a strange shape, right? So if we understand it's not actually photons and light, but it's an electromagnetic spectrum that is on the same chart as photons and light, then we can start looking at an antenna. Here's my little antenna, right? If I have an antenna and it is a full wavelength antenna, so it's a 2 meter antenna on the 2 meter band, then when I turn it on, my lob or my bubble looks like this. Right? Yep, looks like a butt. Okay, so when I turn it on, it looks like this. Now if I cut this in half, right, I'm gonna cut it from the bottom. Now it's gonna stick it out further, and it's going to extend that. So when I don't need to talk high or down into the earth, when I want to talk a big distance with my antenna, a half wavelength antenna is gonna reach further than a full wavelength antenna. It's not gonna be as high of quality sound because it's a half wavelength. Once I cut it down to quarter wavelength, this little quarter wavelength, it starts looking a little bit more like this, shortens it. That's maybe good because I don't want to talk out of the valley and into the mountains over here, right? So you can look at an antenna and tell what frequency that it works on, assuming that it is a full wavelength half wavelength, or quarter wavelength antenna. Mathematically, there are some small antennas like this that will work both in the 2 meter and 75 centimeter range, which is both in the UHF and the VHF range. So I can talk on frequencies of 140 to 150, 60-ish, and I can talk on frequencies of 3, 4, 500 megahertz with one antenna. That's what a dual band antenna is, okay? Let's talk real quick about the very simple basics of one radio talks to another radio. The basic, simplest of the simple, okay? All that is I pick a frequency. I'm gonna pick 146.520. And I'm gonna program my radio to that, 146.520. Then I'm gonna program the other radio to 146.520. And I'm gonna push my PTT, or push to talk button, on the side, and I'm gonna say, hey, yo, what's up? And then someone else on the other side is gonna be like, not much, I'm just chilling and stuff, okay? And that is the most basic function of a radio. Pick a frequency, make them all the same, push the button, and they talk to each other. That is simplex, because it's a simple point to point or node to node. Quick definition of a node. A node is a dumb device that is autonomous. Okay, it is just one thing in a system. It's like your computer connected to the internet is a node. This radio hanging out in outer space by itself is a node. When another radio keys up, they connect to each other. So that's the basic of that. How do we connect to a repeater? There's a bunch of different kinds of repeaters, but 90% of them are one kind. There are old school repeaters. You say something to the repeater, it records it, it pauses for a second, and then it respits it out on the same frequency. Those are simplex repeaters. The problem is, if I am here, my buddy is here, and the repeater is here, I talk to the repeater, my buddy hears it. The repeater repeats what I just said, and then my buddy hears it again. They suck, okay? Those are the worst kind of repeaters. Then there's the cross-banding repeater. A cross-banding repeater, which a lot of your little mobile radios, which are the square ones that you'll see in a vehicle or sometimes in someone's backpack. A cross-bander will send a frequency out on UHF frequency or ultra-high frequency, and it will come back on a VHF or very high frequency. It crosses from one band to the other. The reason that they do that is it takes sensitive technology inside of the radio in order to receive on one frequency and transmit on a half a megahertz lower back. And if you don't want to spend $1,000 on a radio like that, or multiple $1,000s on a radio like that, you just get a $300 one that crossbands. You can talk in one UHF or VHF, talk out the other VHF or UHF. Super simple. So the most common repeater that we have out there is going to be this one. Okay, so I got some dude here, a mountain, a repeater on top, and some dude there. Pretty simple, right? So we have an input frequency and a transmitting frequency. The input frequency is the frequency this dude sends into the repeater. The transmitting frequency is the frequency it sends out and everyone listens on. I like to call it the broadcast frequency, but it's not technically broadcasting, because broadcasting only happens in AM, FM radio, and in ham radio you don't broadcast, you transmit. You're talking one person to the other. Stupid rule, but it's a technicality you need to learn. So I'm going to use a local repeater we have here in Provo. It is the 146.760 repeater. And that is the transmitting frequency. So if I'm just driving down the road and I want to listen to the 7.6, I'm going to turn my radio to 146.760. But if I want to send something into that repeater and it doesn't have a tone, which I'll get to in a minute, then I am going to turn the repeater function on my radio. And when I key that PTT, push to talk, when I key that mic, it's going to drop by negative 600 megahertz. So it's going to drop down to 146.160. Now what's happening here is My little dude is over here. He's listening at 146.760. That's the transmitting frequency. He keys his mic out, and because he's programmed his radio to be on a repeater, it automatically drops by negative 600 megahertz, negative 0.600 megahertz, so it's just a little more than half a megahertz is what we're dropping down by, to the frequency of 146.160, because 7 minus 6 is 1. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Yep, it's 1. So when he pushes his push to talk, it drops by 600 down to 146.160, and simultaneously, because it's a nice expensive repeater radio inside of there, it transmits out on 146.760. So that dude never has to change his radio. He just listens on 146.760. This guy keys up, he's on 146.160. He's like, hey, yo, what's going on? And this repeater hears it, immediately regurgitates it out on 146.760, and everyone else listens to it. Now this guy just got done listening to it, and he wants to talk back. His radio is set up appropriately. He keys the mic, it automatically drops down to the frequency of 146.160, which goes into the repeater. The repeater simultaneously repeats out 146.760, and everyone hears it. That is a duplex repeater. Super simple, right? Okay, I'm gonna add one more layer of confusion to this. Some repeaters are locked with a tone. It is a sub-audible tone, meaning you can't hear it with your ears, but it literally is like a 100 hertz tone that goes ding. When the repeater hears that 100 hertz tone on our 146.160, or whatever the tone is that you got to program into, then and only then will it unlock and start transmitting on the other frequency. So if you have a repeater, the thing that you need to know in order to access that repeater, what's the offset? In this part of the world, for 2 meter, it's negative 600. You can program your repeater to do whatever you want. I'm sorry, negative 0.600. Maybe you want to make it a full megahertz. I don't know. You should stick with the rules so that you're not violating FCC rules, but for the most part, it's negative 600. The other thing you might do for your repeater, because it's a very high traffic area, it's an area where there's a lot of people communicating, is add a sub-audible tone. And when I key the mic, turns that tone on, unlocks, and it works. The last thing that you might do is add a code that you have to type into. So maybe you take up your handheld mic and you type in 1, 2, 3, 4, and the repeater unlocks and you can start using it. And then it will time out and shut off after you're done using it. I don't know why you want to do stuff like this, because it just makes it harder to use the repeater. I get the tone, because then people who aren't trained don't know why it doesn't work. But those are the main things you need to look for. Is what's the input frequency? That's the one you're talking into, or the negative offset or positive offset. What's the transmitting frequency? That's the one you're listening to. Is there a tone? Get all those things programmed inside of your radio, and boom, Bob's your uncle, you can use a repeater. All of this stuff was fine and dandy. Let's actually try it out. I am inside of my garage in a rock house, and I don't know if my antenna is gonna work. We're gonna try it out. So if I turn on my little radio here. Back in the day, you had those AM/FM radios. You spun a dial. That dial was called the variable frequency oscillator. So if you're in VFO mode, or variable frequency oscillation mode, that means you can type in your frequency and go straight to it. If you switch to memory mode, gotta unlock it. So if I switch this over to memory mode, now I've already pre-programmed this frequency. 146.760 is the one I listen to. When I key it up, I can't actually hit the repeater because I'm inside of the building. But if you look closely, come on, focus on me here. If you look closely, when I key this mic, it's on 146.760 and it drops down to 146.160. There's the 160. There's a 760. That little noise that you just heard was the squelch tail. That means I actually hit the repeater that time. This is key. Now I'm in a really bad area, so this is going to be super scratchy. But that's a simple explanation of how to talk to the repeater with a negative 600 offset, and in this case, no subaudible tones. Hopefully this is valuable to you guys. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. Hopefully I've answered all the questions beforehand. And thank you for watching.